also repatriated 44 human remains back to New Zealand. 2 locks of hair from the European Emperor Tsodros II, cut off by a British soldier, was returned after 150 years. In her request to the British Museum a few years ago, Scotter writes from contacts with the British for someone who may have negotiated for African remains or access to photographs for her to exhibit them in Cape Town. Nelson Mandela called for the return of human remains at the Iziko Museum in 2004. He asked, what dignity do African people have when their decapitated bodies are classified as specimens in museums reserved for the depiction of animals? He asked, can we tolerate our ancestors as being shown as people locked in time? On the British Museum website, it is stated that it is not clear that the importance of human remains to the original communities outweigh the significance and importance of the remains as sources of information about human history. The Metropolitan Museum in New York has one of the most celebrated collections in the world, donated by Nelson and Mary Rockefeller in 1965. The website lists it as 10 ancestors' trophy skulls from West Papua. In 1904, Otta Benga, an indigenous person from the Congo, was displayed in the Bronx Zoo with an orangutan with a sign above saying missing link. The last human zoo and ethno displays took place in Belgium in 1958. Many of these skulls were collected as recently as 1955, when Norwegian Thor Heyerdahl brought back remains of indigenous Easter Islanders. The Rapunu, known as very important to the indigenous community, is now kept in the Oslo Kon-Tiki Museum. In November 2019, I was invited by Osbene, an Aboriginal community based in George, to attend rituals on ancestral farms now owned by settlers. This group of activists, some born on these 6 farms, had been negotiating for access to these farms for many decades, simply to pay respects to their ancestors. My young friend, Alex Kirkwood, grew up on one of these farms and were brutally beaten in one of their strafblokke before he ran away from the farm as a child. He says, I was born in 1983. My parents were farm workers on the Van Green and Boerdery Verde farms. 2 of my siblings died at the young age and were buried on the farm. My mother, who died while giving birth to me, were also buried there. When the younger generations of European settlers took over the farms, they decided to extend it into the graveyard in order to grow pumpkins. My elders were forced to plow our ancestral graves. Heavy machinery was used, and when we saw skeleton body parts being pulled up and scattered all over the ground, it was one of the most devastating signs I've ever seen in my life. This community called for the government to immediately stop the plowing of graves by European settlers on ancestral land, investigate the desecration of Second World War graves, investigate the disappearance of slaves forced to work for the Italian prisoners of war, secure visits for the descendants of those buried on these stolen farms. A few months ago, during a ritual of the otter, one more skull with the missing jaw was found by the Aboriginal community in the streams high up in the Outeniqua Mountains. Legend has it that farmers continued to kill workers in their strafblokke and then dumping the bodies high up on the mountains to be eaten by wild animals, but the remains invariably washed downstream during rainy season. Before colonization, the dead was buried immediately close to where the person lived in the kraal as soon as all family and relatives have been informed. Mourning was an individual prerogative as the grave would be close to the home inside the kraal. The next of kin would be bathed and embalmed with buchu for 3 to 6 months. This would mark a period of mourning and healing. The dead would be buried in deep holes towards the rising sun in a sitting position. They would first be smeared with kameeldoring or buchu balm and then wrapped in animal skin and placed in the earth. The hole is then slowly filled up with soil, ensuring that the dirt does not hit the head of the dead. When the grave is closed, it is covered with stones to ensure that wild animals cannot dig it up. Shortly after burial, the grave would be marked with a big rock. Families were buried very close to each other, and children born shortly after the burial often are named after the deceased. Christianity played a role in changing the death rituals. Nowadays, the body is buried 3 to 5 days after death, and sometimes more. Night vigils are also held. Although death rites and burial rites differ from one Khoi nation to the other, all groups have funeral rites and various methods of keeping in touch with the transitioned. The dead becomes ancestors who is in contact with the living through their lives. The ancestors transcends into another spiritual world from which they keep ties with the living. The Khoi have always had grave sites where they visit their deceased. The Khoi believe in the transformation or transition from one status to another. The disturbance of ancestral graves cause great spiritual damage. Those who have had their ancestral graves disturbed remains in a constant state of mourning, as we have seen with the Khoi and San. To become an ancestor is an ongoing process, and one should have lived the kind of life that will decide the kind of ancestor you would then become. It is ironic that even post-apartheid, when human remains are discovered in sacred Khoi spaces like Lion's Head, Table Bay, Clifton, Greenpoint, Bloberg Strand, Victoria and Alfred Waterfront, Deep River, white historians find that they were graves of imported enslaved people, despite the fact that some are thousands of years old, and ostrich eggshell beadwork, tortoise shells, bowls, copper jewelry, etc. are found in the graves. The return of human remains is a crucial part of restorative justice as we bury our ancestors with rituals and burial rites. We need closure. Khoi believe that the remains stay part of the community. We believe that they are, and that gives us a sense of belonging. It is so much more than bones. The return of these remains will help restore our culture, dignity, identity, and existence. Our government should do more to assist in the return of human remains and sacred objects. Government should find the budget to identify the unknown human remains and should then bury them in a public space so that we could all start the mourning process. It is not art, it is my ancestors. We are because they were. Kai Gangangs for your time, Cape of Storms, Table Bay, Falls Bay, Cape of Good Hope, Settler. It was not yours to take. I am Atakwa, and I was born extinct.